Okay, so tonight we're actually going to start with the book of Lamentations.
Okay.
Okay, we finished up chapter 51 and 52 last week, and mainly what chapter 51 and 52 was talking about in Jeremiah was mainly a recapitulation of the destruction of Jerusalem. And many of the things that we have talked about in other passages of scripture through Jeremiah. I think the reason why, and I mentioned that in the class last week, was God really wanted to iterate to the children of Israel why they were being punished. Sometimes in our lives, we don't always know why. And God wanted them to know why and wanted them to understand why he was doing what he was doing and to remind them of the fact that he was still God and they were still answerable to him. And I think there's so many myriad of lessons that could be brought out there. We as the church, we have to always keep in our minds the fact that this is God's church, this is Jesus' church, that we are under shepherds as it was, that our responsibility is to do what we can to shepherd the weak, discipline the wrong, and to help everyone to try to get to heaven. That's what it boils down to. But there also comes a point where in the church, as in Jerusalem and so forth, where if people go too far, then what's going to eventually happen is God's going to punish. And we emphasized, and we should emphasize more and more, the punishment of God. I think we've kind of gotten away from that because that's not the politically correct thing, or that's not what people want to hear. But at the same time, we will be amiss if we don't remind people of that. And it's interesting, you see a lot more of this in the Old Testament than what we might consider in the New. But think about how often, and I've stressed this idea before, Jesus would talk about punishment. Jesus would talk about judgment. And so the application still fits. So as you're coming to the close of that book, as God is putting everything together, he wants to remind them one last time, this is the reason. Here's what you've done. Now we get into the book of Lamentations. And Lamentations is, again, what it suggests. It suggests the idea that it's a funeral dirge. Jerusalem has been destroyed. Jeremiah is walking amidst the ruins before he's taken into Egypt, and he's looking at everything that's gone on. And one of the things that we can't help but realize is that Jeremiah is exposing his emotions. He's looking at everything the way it is, and you see his heart breaking. His heart had been broken all along because he was preaching a message they didn't want to hear. They were finally punished. So now at the end, we find him actually giving these words, this funeral sermon for this city. Now, one of the things that's interesting to me as I look at this, and as I've done some study on this, is that if you look at the outline of the book of Lamentations, you realize that chapters 1 and 2, both made up of 22 verses. Chapters 4 and 5 are made up of 22 verses. Chapter 3 is made up of 66 verses. And we, of course, remember that Jeremiah didn't divide it into chapters and verses as we have it today. But I think there's a reason for that. In fact, when you get into the Hebrew, the actual Hebrew text, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I know Hebrew. I've not studied it. I've not really gone into it. I just go back to what a lot of the commentators suggest. There were 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And what's interesting in the pattern in chapter 1, 2, 4, and 5, you have 22 verses. And every one of the verses start off with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. For example, in Lamentations 1 at verse 1, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. In the Hebrew, that would be Aleph. That would be the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And he would build everything around that letter. And then the second verse would be Beta, and then Gimel, and then Daleth, all the way through the Hebrew alphabet. I think the reason why they did that is because they didn't go down to the local Bible bookstore and buy a Bible. They had to write it out. So more often than not, and perhaps this is something that we have gotten away from, many of the Hebrews would memorize these passages. In fact, from some of the other commentaries I suggested and read, it suggests the idea that whenever this celebration, or not a celebration, but whenever they came every year to the time when Jerusalem was destroyed, this would be part of the reading in the synagogue or wherever it is they were worshiping. And the purpose is to remind them. Again, there are some commentaries that wonder if Jeremiah is the one writing this. I believe that he is, obviously, as you're looking at it in this respect, because he's obviously there. He's looking around at the ruins. He's looking and seeing everything, and I don't see why God would choose somebody else to write this Lamentations when Jeremiah has been lamenting all along, all through the book. This is just the capstone of it. Another thing that we can look at as we go through here is that as we see this pattern to help them to memorize this book also, and I like what this commentary that I encouraged you to buy brought out. If I could just read this very quickly, he says, who needs to study this book? Number one, those who are bearing heavy burdens, like Jeremiah. We need to hear it because of that. Those who have suffered unfair treatment, but they've got to keep doing what's right. Yeah, that's what we need to be going through. Those who are concerned about their relationship with God, those who are not concerned about their relationship with God, those who are deep in sin and rely on others more than God, those who still have faith in the middle of their world crashing in. And that whole idea about how people can be deceived and how God is going to bring that deception to roost, as it was. And then, especially in chapter 3, and as we read through this, we see that everything he says here, chapters 1 and 2, all the way through chapter 3, then all of a sudden he breaks out in praise. It's kind of like he's going downhill. Everything's going downhill until he starts looking at this. And then verse 22 of chapter 3 says, though the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, but his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It's good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It's good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. So you find this crescendo where it comes back up to the top in the midst of all this destruction and bloodshed and everything else that Jeremiah sees. He praises God for his faithfulness. And how many people have you known? How many people have I known walked away from the church because they felt like God left them? They faced a huge crisis in their life, and they got to the point where they didn't think God was there anymore. Yeah. And so many people, I think it's one of those books we just kind of go through very quickly reading it, just to say we've read through the Bible, but this book really resonated with me as we go through all of this, how you hear his weeping, you hear his struggles, but in the midst of it, right in the middle of it all, there's the triumph of faith. And that, to me, again, really hit home, especially in what's gone through in my life the last little bit. Whenever you look at everything else that's going on, and the afflictions, the struggles, think about how we could possibly preach a lesson on something, teach a lesson on this in light of the COVID. In light of what everybody's gone through in the COVID. I read another article today as I was preparing, and Dale Pollard or Neil Pollard wrote an article in there, and he talked about COVID and how it's changed our lives. And he just asked a question, and I'm finding a lot more preachers are doing this. How long are we going to stay in this COVID mode? We know that in all probability, like the flu, it's going to be around for a while, So what do? We give up. We just surrender, say, well, let's just close our doors because we're afraid of getting COVID, you know, and he asked some very valid questions in this article that he wrote today. Well, how long are you going to be afraid? How long will you not get out? Why is it that there's inconsistencies? You won't go to church, but you'll go to Walmart and all these other places, you know. Yeah. He gets honest about a lot of this stuff, and I've appreciated what he had to say. And toward the end, he's asking the question, how long will we live by fear and not by faith? So I think right now, especially, Lamentations has a great message for the church today, that we need to get our focus back on where it needs to be. And remember that in the midst of all of this, in the midst of chaos, the world seems totally 100% out of control. In the midst of all of this, when we keep our faith on God, that's what's important. And then after hitting that crescendo, he goes back down once again and starts talking about everything bad that they're going through in their lives. So as we look at this, you start seeing these details. You start seeing these things that he's trying to stress all the way through the book. And again, how important it is, how lonely. The word "how" here in this context was used as an exclamation. How long or how lonely sits the city that was full of people. So Jeremiah literally is looking around, and he remembered the other days as he was preaching, all the time that he served maybe as a priest in these situations. And so he says that the city was full of people, but now she's like a widow. And it's interesting again that God is specifically mentioning the idea of a widow, one who has lost her husband. As the Jewish nation itself, because of their sin, her husband has walked away. Her husband has left. God has left. So Jerusalem is like a widow. She was great among the nations, but the princess among the provinces had become a slave. The word slave here comes from a Hebrew word which means you have a princess that would dare not do anything to soil herself in any way, but this princess, as it was, God's people and their children are now in forced labor. Sometimes I have envisioned that as the children of Israel went from Jerusalem to Babylon, and as they were carried into captivity, we know that they were enslaved, but I wonder sometimes how many of us really grasp what that meant. Sometimes I've had the idea that they were just taken there and forced to live in different surroundings, but no, it was more than that. They were forced to live in those different surroundings as slaves again. They had no right to decide what their manner of life would be. Their life was totally decided for them. What they had, the blessings, whatever blessings they had to keep them alive, literally, they probably had to work 7 days a week for. There was no mercy shown. They were captives. They were slaves. That's the way nations would grow and become big and build great grand buildings and so forth like that. Why? Through slavery. So that's the point he's making. They're to forced labor. That should have reminded them about Egypt. What caused them to get to that way? Again, we know what the situation is. It was their sin. So he picks up in verse 2, and again, remembering the idea that in the Hebrew, this starts with the second letter of the Greek or Hebrew alphabet. She weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. And so now he's portraying Israel and Judah in captivity, weeping, thinking perhaps of what they had before, being around Jerusalem, being free to do what they wish to, not having to go to bed every night, totally exhausted from doing the work for their owners. I could see the tears on her cheeks. All her lovers. Now, think about the idea of all of her lovers. That would be all the ones that she probably trusted in to help fight against Babylon. And again, think about how often those images would be out there, but she has no one there to comfort her. All of her friends, all of these other nations were not able to stop the juggernaut of the Babylonian Empire. We do know that they appealed to Egypt. Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar punished Egypt. We know that over and over again, they tried to make governmental alliances. And before it was all over with, what was it? She's left by herself, totally alone. That's it. Again, as I'm reading through this, I'm thinking about all the alliances that we've had in the United States over the 200 plus years we've been around. I think about especially during World War I, World War II, and so forth, what we had and what we was able to do and how we were able to come out ahead before it was all over with. But there came a point with Jerusalem that her sins had to be punished. So there's nobody there to help her. Nobody. And all of these, quote, lovers, she has her tears on her cheeks, thinking about those other days. And in fact, they probably sold her out. They sold her out. So Judah has gone into captivity. And again, notice the stress. It's not just, okay, they're there making a living over there. They're under affliction and hard servitude. She dwells among the nations. The nations here, more often than not, suggest the Gentiles, a totally different culture that Jerusalem and the Jews had been used to in one sense. In another sense, because she had associated so much with these other nations, she had become too much like them. And so they would have understood some of it. And God was saying, okay, if you're not going to be faithful to me, I'll let you go to those nations. But you won't go willingly. You'll be having to go as a slave. So she dwells among the nations and she finds no rest. There's always that hopelessness, that reality. This isn't home. I didn't want to be here. I was forced to come here. Life is not good here. We're slaves. We could be beaten by any Babylonian soldier that walks our way. We could be accused and thrown into prison and even put to death, if it comes down to it, just because we're not doing things their way. And notice, he says she finds no rest, and all her persecutors overtake her in dire straits. There was no place she could flee from Babylon. There was no place she could run. The roads now, he's thought about the people gone. And as he continues to think about it, he would think also about the temple, him being a priest, how important that was to him. He would think about the feast of the Jews. And as he goes on and meditates on this, always remember, and you know this, that inspired by the Holy Spirit, her adversaries, the roads to Zion mourn because no one comes to the feasts. They're not worshiping in the way that they once did. They're not glorifying God for his deliverance from Egypt. They probably, many of them are saying, where was God in all of this? And God is saying, I've been where I've always been. You just wouldn't listen to me. You wouldn't be there. Think about, again, in the church, do we have a lot of folks saying the same thing today? Where's God in the midst of COVID? He's still where he's always been. He hadn't abdicated the throne. He's still doing what he needs to do. And, why don't people come to church anymore? Why aren't they coming to the set feet? They're afraid. Fear instead of faith. And he says, her gates are desolate. Her priests sigh. They're no longer able to serve in the temple. They're having to do things that, think about being a priest. They had hard work. They would have to kill the bulls and so forth and offer the sacrifices. There was a lot of hard work to that. I'm not going to argue that at least a little bit. But think about how they may have thought of their times worshiping in the temple, and wishing they had the opportunity to do it again. it goes back to that old adage, you don't miss something until you don't have it anymore, right?
Yeah.
And think about that in that respect. Think about, again, going back, trying to make the application for today, how, again, they're not going through what they used to. Their whole world's been turned upside down. But whose fault was it? It was theirs. It was theirs. Notice her virgins are afflicted. Think about if you were a young person at that time and you were maybe thinking about getting married. You may have been betrothed to someone, and that someone may have died in battle against the Babylonians. You think also about the idea, and again, we've got to visualize this, and it's not something that we want to visualize, but we've got to think about the wickedness of that time. When the Babylonians took over, it would be much like the Taliban, okay? In the fact that women wouldn't be respected. In fact, they would probably be assaulted more often than not. And so you have these virgins that are afflicted. And again, some of the texts, some of the translations actually suggest that idea. And she is in bitterness. Her whole city is in bitterness. Her adversaries, her enemies have become the master. Her enemies prosper while she's suffering. They're prospering at her expense. For the Lord has afflicted her because of the multitude of her transgressions. It's not a situation, and this is what Jeremiah is trying to bring across. And every time I've studied Jeremiah, and I go back to the Old Testament and I see this over and over again, we see the idea that God is, and I've mentioned it many times, but it keep coming up, that God is in charge of all the nations. So here again, it's not that Babylon has punished her because they had done something against Babylon. No. It's because Babylon was used by God to punish her. And we're going to especially see this in the next few verses, whenever he starts talking about how the Lord is punishing, the Lord is punishing, the Lord is punishing. And so when we get into that, we'll see this idea that it's because of the multitude of her transgressions, her children have gone into captivity before the enemy. This is it. Here's the reason. Again, how many times today I think about this in the church, well, you talk to somebody that's not there anymore. Well, I don't feel comfortable there anymore, or I just don't feel like I'm getting what I need there anymore. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that one. I can't, we're just not where we need to be. And maybe there's truth to that, right? You know what I'm saying? There may be truth to that, but again, more often than not, that becomes excuses. Well, it's not my fault. It's the church's fault. I've left because somebody there offended me, upset me. And God knows what's going on. And God, and I think this is the case too. You look at the first century, the church in the first century grew because they were scattered abroad because of persecution. I've mentioned personally my opinion that could very well be coming up to the situation in our country now, because we haven't done what we needing to do. We've been more concerned about things that don't matter. And God is saying, look, these things do matter. You need to be faithful to me. You need to be faithful in what I'm asking you to do. We could spend hours talking about that. We could spend hours literally sharing that idea. I think about how you know what I'm talking about. When I was growing up in the church in Florence, all I heard, or a lot of the things I heard was, well, you need to be faithful in attendance, and you do. I understand that. I understand that. But the generation that's come up now, they don't see that. And so you preach about it. Well, and again, I remember being told years ago, well, if you're not here for every service, you could lose your soul. And I'm like, whoa, I don't want to do that. You say that to the generation growing up now, and they'll say, well, who says we have to be here? How many times have you heard Hebrews 10:25 quoted for that purpose?
Yep.
And the question is, well, it doesn't say in the Bible that you have to meet 2 times on Sunday. Okay, well, yeah, I do read where they would meet, but when they met, they stayed there long enough to do what they needed to do. I'm not opposed to just having one service, but let's not get it down to 30 minutes, a couple of songs, and that's it. Let's not do that. But what I'm finding is that what I was taught, and not you, obviously, and so many of us, it's not being taught, or they're not getting it, or they actually come out and say, well, do the elders really have a right to say when we meet? And that gets into the whole other question of obedience to elders. Why should we be obedient to elders? Both of those ideas, to me, are kicking the door open for other things. If I'm not going to be obedient to what the Lord has asked the elders who asked me to be there, then I could just pretty well dismiss and do whatever I want to do. Have you kind of seen that kind of situation in the church there?
Oh, yeah.
and how do you deal with that?
Best you can, but it's not an easy thing to deal with.
It's not. And sometimes I think we talk a lot about preachers' meetings and preachers getting together and meeting and all. And it's been so funny. Y'all have it over there at Piedmont Road. And every time lately that I have a chance to go, something comes up at South Common. I can't get over there to them. And it's just like, and after a while, you do get a little bit discouraged and wonder if you're the only one left because you're over here in this situation. But I wonder sometimes, and maybe we ought not to have elders meetings and just get elders meetings with one another. How do you deal with this situation? How do you deal with this? What are your responses? What are your thoughts? Man, think about what would happen if the church in this area not only would have the preachers' meetings, but also the elders' meetings, and try to figure out some of this stuff and try to come to grips with this together and see if we can come up with some sort of consensus. Yeah. How do you handle this stuff? My opinion. Okay, let's get back to the text. But think about that, and if there's a way, maybe somewhere down the line, maybe we could do that. All righty. Okay. All right. I'd love to do that. I'd love to pick somebody's brains besides, just me and Dwayne and what we're trying to do over here. I'd love to sit down and say, okay, how do you deal with this? And anyway. All right, now, verse 6, from the daughter of Zion, her splendor, all her splendor has departed. Think about it one time. This was a beautiful, beautiful nation, beautiful place to live, and now it's just rubble. Her princes have become like deer. They find no pasture. They flee. They're gone. They have no strength before the pursuer. All the princes would have been taken into captivity. Yet we also remember Zedekiah's sons were killed before his eyes. So there's no civil leadership there except what Babylon's left. They're the enemy. So as far as we're concerned, they're still, we don't want to still do what they need to do. And again, Babylon's going to have enough soldiers there that whenever, if anybody does try to rebel, they're going to pay the price. When these Jews went down to Egypt hoping that they could flee from this, they never did. They were all perished. They all perished there in Egypt whenever Babylon came down later and took care of Egypt. So in the middle of this, he says, in the days of her affliction and roaming, Jerusalem remembers all her pleasant things that she had in the days of old. We always have a tendency to look at the things in the past, not all of them, but most of them, with feelings of fondness, don't we? Yeah, I remember how it was years ago, and I remember how You know, we were building big buildings because we couldn't seat everybody. And now it's like trying to get everybody there to see what we've got. And we've still got huge empty spaces. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He says, you know, they remembered all her pleasant things. But again, when do we appreciate those things? It's whenever we don't have them anymore. And I think in the same respect is this. Her people fell into the hand of the enemy with no one to help her. And the adversary saw her and mocked at her removal, her downfall, her Sabbaths, her everything. You know, they just lost everything. They remembered. All right, why? Why are they punished? Why is all these things happening? Jerusalem has sinned gravely, he says in verse 8. And again, 1 Kings 8, Jeremiah 13, Ezekiel, Hosea, on and on. There's so many passages that stress that. She has become vile, and all who honored her despise her because they've seen her nakedness. And she sighs and turns away. Some people have suggested the idea that the book of Lamentations could be called the great big sigh, looking back over what they had, thinking about where they are now, and wishing that things were different. And they could have been if they had repented, but they didn't see the need. And even those left in the city of Jerusalem that had the chance, no, we're going to go on down to Egypt. Notice her uncleanness is in her skirts. How many times do a lot of the prophetic writers suggest the idea that her people, God's people, have been guilty of adultery, spiritual adultery, worshiping all these other gods, all these other idols, and committing spiritual adultery? So a lot of the things that we're reading through here, as I said, a lot of these things keep pointing back to that idea. The whole story of Hosea and how God told him to marry Gomer, and her unfaithfulness was an object lesson for everybody. So here again, this is the same idea of these people not being faithful to God. Could this preach today? Yes. Yeah. Has the church resorted to other things to try to gain members? And I like what one brother says, you know, we don't need to be resorting to the things of the world because the worldly already have the things of the world. Why do we need to go to worldly things to try to get them to come to attend the services with us? We don't need to do that. And I agree with that, you know, because what's going to be the difference between that? Why is it that sometimes as you're looking at the whole religious scenario, everybody's looking for, I need to find a place where my children will grow, or where I feel comfortable, or where I feel the Spirit move. You know, we can go on and on and on, and it all becomes about us. We have made ourselves idols. And so here, it again, is that figure still there? Yeah. Now, if you were to preach that and teach that, this idea of this committing this spiritual adultery, some folks would get kind of uncomfortable about it. Well, you know, we ought not kind of preach about those kind of sins. Yeah, we do. Because if they did it, we can do it and have been doing it. She did not consider her destiny. Now, there's another part of it. Even though Jeremiah and other prophets had warned time and again of what this was going to take them to, they just refused to listen. So he says in verse 9, her collapse was awesome, and she had no comforter. There's nobody there that's going to take her side. Nobody there is going to help her. All of her allies have been destroyed by this juggernaut. So in essence, he says, Lord, behold my affliction. The enemy is exalted. And so it's all, he's pleading. He's wanting them to see how things are. And again, you have the adversary spread his hand over all her pleasant things, her desirable things. She's seen the nations enter her sanctuary, those whom you commanded not to enter your assembly. Think about how it must have been like that third time, 586, whenever he finally destroyed the temple into the most holy place, took the Ark of the Covenant captive. Think about the whole idea of this just really literally destroyed everything they had. And they were just, it's kind of like, again, she's got whatever she wanted. And he says, they have desecrated the temple. And again, all her people sigh. They seek bread. They're hunting for food. Obviously, they would not have committed cannibalism. That would have been against the Old Testament law, but there's not much left. Babylon has taken everything that she's wanted. And they have to just literally forage day in and day out. Think about, again, the tragedy of, and again, he's going to emphasize this, about the fact that children starving and mothers not being able to do anything about it. They seek bread. They've given their valuables for food to restore life. Okay, you give whoever something for a morsel of food, or for maybe for a small meal. You're giving everything you've got, but then what? After that, you've got nothing, right? You've got, what else are you going to use? What else are you going to use? And he says, see, O Lord, and consider, for I am scorned. Now notice verse 9, O Lord, behold my affliction. Verse 11, O Lord, consider that I am scorned. So in the midst of this, as he continues to bring this ideal out, he just says, Lord, you see me. You see what's going on here. And he says, and you see these prayers. The enemy is exalted. I am scorned. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? See if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which has been brought on me, which the Lord has inflicted in the day of his fierce anger. It was not Babylon. It was the Lord that did this. It was the Lord that punished them. And that's what Jeremiah has been saying all along, all through the book. This is God's doing because of your sins. So he says, he has sent fire into my bones, and it's overpowered them. Again, a lot of different commentators suggest that maybe because of a lack of food, their body is susceptible more to disease, pestilence. So now you might have, talking about fever, fire into my bones. And what happens with fever over a period of time, it just weakens the body to the point where they can't do anything else. Think again, we'll see this in a few moments. Children begging for something to eat, and you're not being able to give them anything or give them anything. Mothers trying to do what they can, weeping in tears, thinking maybe that it would have been better if this child had been killed in the siege rather than watch the child die from hunger. Again, do we grasp that? Do we get that? Every once in a while, we might see these television ads of these children that are starving to death. And maybe our hearts may be touched for just a little while, but again, so much. And we get to thinking to ourselves, there's just so much there. What can we do? How can we help? A lot of them in India, right? And again, you go back and talk about the idea of that culture and why they're not doing what they need to do in that respect. And then COVID hit it. So it's just a sad situation. And as I've been reading through this and I see those ads, then I'm troubled a little bit more. I'm bothered a little bit more. I now begin to understand a little bit more of what Jeremiah saw on a day-by-day basis and how he was struggling with that. He has spread a net for my feet and turned me back. And he's made me desolate and faint all the day. Jeremiah was able to eat something because the governor was taking care of Jeremiah on Nebuchadnezzar's bequest. Do you think Jeremiah probably helped dole out what he could to help others? Yeah. Did he ever get to thinking to himself that there's just too much suffering and not enough food? Obviously, not enough to take care of them. I like to see him a man that sacrificed himself all up to the point, and yeah, even sacrificed this if he could. And he says, he's made me desolate and faint. He also, this passage could be talking about the ideal of how sad he was at everything. And what good would it say, I told you so here? Nothing. I just can't even begin to imagine how bad and how horrible it would have been. And then because, again, lack of food, then there's going to be plagues. There's going to be other struggles that they're going to have to be facing. And it seems like that there's no end to it. There's nobody coming to their aid. The ones that are left in the city of Jerusalem might be able to plant something next year, but you're talking a year out, you're going to have to really struggle. And you have to save some of the seed and so forth just to be able to plant something for next year, right?
Yeah.
I can't imagine. And I hope I don't have to imagine. And I hope my children don't have to imagine or to actually see what was going on there. The yoke of my transgressions were bound. He said in verse 14, they were watched over. They were woven together by his hands and thrust upon my neck. So he says, speaking as a people, God knew all of my transgression. They were woven together, thrust upon my neck, something like a yoke that would have been placed on the neck of a donkey or a bull. And so whenever you're carrying that burden, then made your strength fail, not only because physical, but think about it spiritually. When you see all this deprivation and all, and probably it was, I hate to say it, I hate to think about it, but I think it may very well have been the case. In fact, we will be seeing this a little bit later on, where people are eating people, cannibalism, just to be able to live. And so that burden, that yoke, that heaviness would be there. And he says, the Lord delivered me into the hands of those with whom I'm not able to withstand. What can I do about this? The Lord trampled all my mighty in my midst. He called an assembly against me. At no time in Jeremiah or here in Lamentations does he ever say that this was Babylon who did it. What he's saying is the Lord has done all of this because he's punishing my people. Did he use Babylon to do it? Yes. But again, he trampled us as in a winepress, the virgin daughter of Judah. And so for these things I weep. We often call Jeremiah the weeping prophet. This is one of those passages that emphasize this. My eye overflows with water. The comforter who should restore my life is far from me. The Lord who should help me is far from me. But why? Because he's honored their request. They were serving other gods. God said, let them serve you. Let them other gods take care of you. And so he says, my children are desolate because the enemy prevail. So again, as I've envisioned this in my mind, and as you probably have to, and I hope you see it, number one, people are starving. Their dead bodies laying around, obviously from the conquest itself. Afterwards, did they get anybody to start digging graves to put the dead in? I would hope so. Maybe, perhaps, maybe. I keep saying this, we don't really read of it, but maybe the Babylonian governor would have demanded that this be done just for their sake, in trying to make sure there wouldn't be any pestilence from this. There's not enough food to feed everybody. The Babylonian governor is going to get what he's going to get. He's going to make sure he's taken care of, and that the Babylonian government, as it sits there, the puppet government as it was, is going to be taken care of. But these people are not going to care about the Jews. Think about Jeremiah walking around, seeing the dead body, smelling it, smelling the stench, thinking about the way it was, the way it is now. Think about all of these things in his heart. And again, he sees bloodstains all over the place. Much like, again, and I don't think it's just by accident, where God trampled as a winepress the virgin daughter of Judah. How often does wine have a comparison with red and blood and stuff like that? So God has trampled the winepress. And so he just says, you know what? There's no comfort. There's nothing here. The enemy prevailed. Zion, this is God's people, spreads out her hands, prays, but no one comforts her. God's turned his back on them because that's what they wanted. Is God just? Yes. The Lord has commanded concerning Jacob that those around him become his adversaries. Jerusalem has become an unclean thing among them. So the folks that are left, they're out trying to make a living. They're out trying to do what they can do. And to make a long story short, there's not enough for everybody. There's not enough for everybody. So right here, why? Why? In this sad, sad situation, in all of this, why? Here it is. Verse 18 really starts telling us why. The Lord is righteous. I rebelled against his commandment. And I think he's talking about poetic language, saying that the nation of Israel, the nation of Judah did this. He says, now, behold my sorrow. My virgins, my young men have gone into captivity. The Lord is right in what he did here. The Lord, Jeremiah says, the Lord is right. For as a nation, yeah, we rebelled against his commandments. We weren't doing this. What good would it have done as well for Jeremiah says, I told you so. But now they've got to deal with it. And he says, I want you to behold my sorrow. And again, the virgins, my young men, have gone into captivity. I called for my lovers. This would be the other nations. This would possibly be the other gods that they were worshiping. But they deceived me. My priests and elders breathed their last in the city while they sought food to restore their life. See, O Lord, that I'm in distress. My soul is troubled. My heart is overturned. I have been very rebellious. Outside, the sword bereaves. At home, it is like death. I try to envision this as much as I can, and I've tried to share this with you on this video and so forth. And I just think, again, that my description comes nowhere close to what we can even begin to imagine. The only ones that might know something like this might be soldiers that have been in war and have fought and saw the dead bodies and everything else all around. That's the only ones that I think could really envision what's going on here. Think about the hunger. My dad was in Vietnam, 2 tours of duty there, and he took pictures. I've got them on slides of the starving children and how he wanted so much to help them out, but he couldn't. I have a letter, the only letter, and this was an interesting story. I don't know if I've told you this story or not. I went to college at Heritage Christian at the time, International Bible College, and the librarian there, Jamie Cox, me and her became good friends. Because I just respected her, and I just, and I told her how much I appreciated all she did. And she was going through, and I'm going to mention the name you probably know. Whenever Jack Wilhelm died, she got all of his papers. And in the middle of those papers was a letter from my dad in Vietnam, writing to Jack Wilhelm for money to help pay for a school there in Vietnam to teach the children. And in the letter, I've got the actual copy of the letter myself. And I thanked her profusely. And whenever I see her again, I'm going to go up there and hug her neck for her. You know what I'm saying? Because this is something special. And every once in a while, I'll look at his handwriting. But what he asked for was that. And he mentioned the fact that in the village that he was in, that the Viet Cong had offered $1 of American money for any child that would go in and burn the schoolhouse. Now, that's war. And he said this schoolhouse was burned because a child wanted some money so that they might be able to get something. And I think about that whole situation in Vietnam, these kids starving to death. $1, an American dollar, man, they could get something out of that,
Yeah.
They could help feed their family or something like that. Yeah, I'd do that for $1. I'd be happy to do it just to be able to feed my family. I have lived in the United States all this time, and I've not seen anything like that. I've gone on a couple of mission trips down in Central America, but it's nothing compared to some of the things that we see in these war-torn zones. So I try my best when I'm looking at this just to try to look at it from that viewpoint and see how these people must have felt. It's appropriate in another sense, as I mentioned in the very beginning of this lesson, it's a very appropriate thing in that the Jews would read this once a year at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, hopefully in causing the people of Israel to realize that the only reason they're still here is because of God's mercy and God's love. But also the very dire warnings to every generation of what happens whenever we get away from God. So maybe, just maybe, we need to read, I know that in a lot of our Bible classes, we try to cram so much in an hour in 13 weeks. You're teaching Jeremiah and you're trying to cram it all in, but I wonder sometimes if we could teach at least 1 or 2 lessons just on the book of Lamentations. I don't know how many of us really get, especially in the church, really get what Jeremiah is talking about here. But perhaps if we really spent that time looking at this, then we probably would hear a lot of these folks say, I don't like that book a whole lot. Let's not study that anymore. I hear that now. I feel uncomfortable here, and yeah. That's the point. And as these Jews would read it year after year after year, that should have been a reminder year after year after year of what God does. They have heard that I sigh, verse 21, but no one comforts me. All my enemies have heard of my trouble. They are glad that you have done it. Bring on the day you have announced that they may become like me. This is another thing that we find a lot in the Old Testament that we struggle with in the New Testament, right? Where we find that God's people even ask God to punish the other people. Now we're sitting there thinking to ourselves, well, that's not very Christian-like. That's not very much like Christ. And well, we're talking about the Old Testament here. So their idea was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So, Lord, you punish those people. You punished us. Now you punish them. Bring on the day that you have announced or you have proclaimed that they may become like me. Jeremiah and some of these others had prophesied of Babylon's destruction. So he's saying, Lord, let them become like me. we're suffering right now. We're hurting. We're aching right now. And I want them to hurt as much as we're hurting. Is that Christ-like? I can hear somebody saying that right now. Is that Christ-like? Is that what Christ would do? Well, did he not warn the children of Israel? And did he not tell them in Matthew 24 what was going to happen to Jerusalem because ultimately they're crucifying the Christ? Was judgment sent on Jerusalem for that? Again, yes, it was. So is it wrong to do that? Well, that just makes me feel uncomfortable. And I don't want to be a part of a church that's just going to preach the bad news. Well, I don't want to be a part of that either. I want to be a part of a church that preaches the bad news so that I can, whenever I hear the good news, I'll rejoice in it and take advantage of it. Yeah. And I think, again, maybe because we have gotten away from hellfire and brimstone preaching, that may be part of the reason why a lot of folks think, I'm okay, you're okay, we're all going to make it to heaven together. Okay. And that's not the case. So he says, in verse 22, let all their wickedness come before you, and do to them as you've done to me for all my transgressions. For my sighs are many, and my heart is faint. So, Lord, you get them the way you got us. Now, remembering again, they didn't go down to the Bible bookstore. Obviously, every one of those letters, as you begin verse 9, 10, 11, and so forth, that would always be reminded of what's going on. This would help this stick into their mind. And he closes this chapter out with, again, this heart faint, sighs that are many, all their wickedness coming before them. So we go on into chapter 2, and he picks up right there again with the same thing. It's 7:30 right now. Let's take about a 5-minute break. Let me warm my throat a little bit, and we'll pick up there. All right.
All right.
All right, chapter 2 is much the same way. It's 22 verses. And again, every one of the verses start with the Hebrew alphabet. In this chapter, more than what we've just read, and we've kind of seen a little bit of it here earlier in chapter 1, is the idea of the Lord is righteous. I rebelled against his commandments. The Lord has commanded that those around him become his adversaries, verse 17, verse 18. So now, in this passage, more than anything else, you're going to see the Lord being the one that did it. In this commentary, again, he uses the word Lord or Lord 8 times. He uses the pronoun he 23 times, is 14 times. It's like he, the Lord, he. And so as you look at that, keep looking for that idea. And in this, it's showing that God is not taking Jerusalem's side, but filling her with the enemy and creating all the things that they're having to go through. So he just continues to do this. He's not making any apologies about what God is doing. He's saying this is what God's will is, and this is reason why. And he's not trying to defend God. He's just saying this is what God is going to do. I wonder sometimes, do we try to defend God too much? Does God need our defense? Not really. He can handle whatever he wants to any way he wants to. But I think, again, the world has tried to back the church into that corner of trying to defend punishing a God of justice. They don't want to talk about hell. They don't want to talk about punishment. And yet all through the Old Testament, that idea comes out over and over and over and over again. So should we be spending our time trying to defend God in that respect, or just simply say, here's what it is, and it is what it is, and there's nothing you can do to change that? God is God. You can't change his character. You can't change his qualities. What it boils down to is whether or not you're going to believe him or not. And many people will not, because they don't think of God, or they don't want to think of a God like that. But even if they don't want to think of a God like that, that's how God describes himself. So I don't think we need to be apologizing at all about how God describes himself. And if he claims to be a God of justice, a God of mercy, we want to emphasize the justice part, rightly so. That's what the story of the Bible's about, how his
Yeah.
grace and mercy was evident in the cross. But you've got to hear the bad news first. So I'm not asking you for you to answer this, but think about, when was the last time you heard a sermon on hell? Or even punishment, for that matter? And I've been convicted in this respect, because I was sitting there looking at myself and thinking about, well, when's the last time I preached on something like this? And it's not something that we want to hear, but it's something we need to hear.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe that's another thing that might encourage all of us to be fired up as we're looking through this book. How, again, how. Now notice chapter 1 starts off with the word how. And I mentioned the fact that it's an exclamation. Here again, it starts again. How the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger. Now, notice the idea of a cloud in his anger. It's like every part of it, it's like a fog. And his anger is everywhere. It's manifested everywhere. He cast down from heaven to the earth the beauty of Israel. He did it, because of their sins. And notice, and he did not remember his footstool in the day of his anger. As he had his people here on this earth, he was emphasizing the idea that when it came time for me to punish, I'm going to punish my people just like I'd punish any other nation. Maybe even more so, because they knew better, but they didn't do better.
Yeah.
So he said he swallowed up. The Lord has swallowed up and not pitied. We talk a lot again about God's grace, and rightly so. But how important is it that we still balance that out with the fact that God is just and God does not pity those who make the decision to stay in sin? Is that harsh? Is that the truth? And again, that's it. He said he's not pitied all the dwelling places of Jacob. He's thrown down in his wrath the strongholds, the areas of strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought them down to the ground, and he has profaned the kingdom and its princes. But really, as he says, he's brought them down to the ground. That was their punishment. But it says he has profaned them, the kingdom and its princes. But in a sense, is not the punishment applicable to the crime? They had already profaned themselves, worshiping the idols, offering the babies as sacrifice, the god Molech, and everything we've studied back in Jeremiah. So, okay, if that's the way you want to live, I will honor that. And I'll profane you as well. And I will not keep you in the midst of all this destruction. I will allow you to deal with what you're going to have to deal with. He's cut off in fierce anger every horn. Now, a lot of times in the scriptures, the idea of horns suggests the idea of strength. So if you had a bull that had a big horn, it suggested the idea of strength. Well, here in this particular passage, using it in that respect, he's suggesting the idea that their strength is cut off. The only way that they were able to maintain where they were in the city of Jerusalem was because God allowed them to stay there, and he blessed them there. But because they chose to do this other way, he cuts off their horn. They have no strength. They are and have been taken by just anybody. The Assyrians, like I said, the Babylonians. Think about all through the time before there was a king, especially during the time of the judges. Now, there were wars and battles and fights all the time. If there's one thing that I could say about the children of Israel, is out of all the people on the face of the earth, they folks ought to know how to fight, because they've been fighting ever since they got to the earth, right? That's just it. And so he says he's cut off their strength. He's drawn back his right hand. If God is helping his people, he's going to give them the right hand. I think it's often said, and I think we understand this, that the idea of the right hand suggests the idea of a strong hand. More people are right-handed than left-handed. And whatever hand we use the most is the one that we have this greatest strength. So I think a lot of times in this praise, his right hand suggests his powerful hand, but he's drawn back his powerful hand from before the enemy. So if he's drawn back the hand from destroying the enemy, he's allowing the enemy to do it. Who is actually doing the punishing? Not Nebuchadnezzar, not the Babylonians. God is. And so he's blazed against Jacob like a flaming fire devouring all around. Standing like an enemy, God has bent his bow. With his right hand like an adversary, he's slain all who are pleasing to his sight. Now, is this talking about God or is it talking about the enemy? We've already seen that God is using the enemy against his people. And notice the word he has blazed, he who? God, against Jacob like a devouring fire. So standing like an enemy, he has bent his bow. With his right hand like an adversary, he has slain all who are pleasing to his eye. So you see, there's that phrase, he his, all through this passage. He has slain all who are pleasing to his eye. Now, what does that mean? He was pleasing to his eye. Did he not show mercy to those that were trying to do his will? I think so. Did he show mercy to Jeremiah? Yeah, I think so. But even at that, even though there were righteous people, they still had to bear the consequences of the sins of others. We bear the consequences of the sins of others all the time. I don't think we think about that a lot of times, but we do. Every time a new law is written, it's because they're trying to outlaw something that the world might consider to be wicked, right? So then it might make problems for us. True or false? I mean, so, you know, and that's kind of the way that we think about this thing. Here in this same respect, he has used these people to slay those who are pleasing to his eyes, and he's poured out his fury like fire. Again, fire burning everything up. And that's the reason why I think we find in the New Testament that the idea of hell or Hades is often described as a burning fire, an everlasting fire. So these things come into understanding. The Lord was like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up her palaces. He has destroyed her strongholds and increased mourning and lamentation in the daughter of Judah. We've seen it. And again, it bears repeating. Jeremiah is making it clear that it is not Nebuchadnezzar and just the wars of the nations. It is God bringing this about. In the same respect, I think God does the same things today. But it's hard for me, because I'm not inspired, to notice how everything's actually going to work out and what nation is going to be destroyed next and what nation is going to be punished next and why. I may not be able to see it. I can see sins in our nation. I can see things in our country that God clearly condemned that causes our country to be fallen, but I can't condemn it in other nations because I don't see it as much as I see it here. Yeah. So I think as Jeremiah is writing this, he's wanting them to understand, listen, this is God's doing because of your sins. He has done violence to his tabernacle. The word tabernacle suggests the idea of a booth. And again, think about the idea of the temple that was patterned after the tabernacle. He said, as if it were a garden, he's destroyed his place of assembly. God destroyed the place of assembly. It was not the Babylonians, it was God that did it. In AD 70, it was God who did it with the Romans. And again, that brings out another interesting sideline. God is not so much interested in the building as much as he's interested in the people. The church is the people. So God has caused the appointed feast and Sabbaths to be forgotten in Zion. One of the condemnations that he really made over and over again was the fact that they weren't keeping the Sabbath. And whenever they actually come back, as you read in the book of Nehemiah, as he serves as the governor, one of the sins that the children of Israel once again engaged in was Sabbath breaking. God is serious about that. That brings up to a great discussion in that respect. Why does God place so much emphasis upon the Sabbath? Have you ever really thought that thing through a little bit? I've tried to on a few occasions, and we know in the very beginning, you remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy in Exodus chapter 20. And again, this was something that was commanded. It seems like that they were doing that for a while when Moses was there. Another great lesson on leadership is whenever you have good leaders, you have people that are doing what's right. When you don't have good leaders, then you have people that are going and just doing whatever they want to do. So another lesson on leadership there. Think about the idea that the Sabbath becomes an issue all through the Bible. And as I think happens, it starts off with by breaking the Sabbath, and then it goes to bigger and bigger and bigger things. Kind of like, telling that first little lie, and then it becomes easier to tell another one, and easier to tell another one, and easier to tell another one. And I think that's part of it. Why did God set up the Sabbath? He wanted one day for us to rest, for mankind to rest, especially his people specifically. But it was for the purpose of rest. God knew that we needed that. So as we work through this together, we have to realize that the Lord calls these things to be forgotten in Zion. Why? Now it's not because the children of Israel have forgotten it, but because they're not there to have the feast anymore. They're not there to have the Sabbaths. In captivity, they did not have a day of rest. They didn't have a day off. They didn't have a day off under Babylonian captivity either. So you think about it, these were things that impressed them so much that, and again, I think I read 2 Chronicles, the last chapter, where he emphasized the idea that the reason why they were sent into 70 years captivity was so that the land may have its Sabbath rests. Remember that in 2 Chronicles. So the idea is that God allowed them that 70 years because that's what they have been doing and disregarding it. And that's the reason why it becomes such an issue in the New Testament. The Lord has spurned his altar and abandoned his sanctuary. He has given up, or he has surrendered, or he has delivered the walls of her palaces into the hand of the enemy. They have made a noise in the house of the Lord as on the day of a set feast. So think about again how it must have, if you were a devout Jew at that time and you saw pagans in the temple, and that would be destroying your heart as well. The Lord has purposed, he has determined to destroy the wall of the daughter of Zion. He stretched out a line. He's not withdrawn his hand. Therefore, he has caused the rampart and the wall to lament. They languish together. Now, see the poetic language. Obviously, the rampart and the walls, they're not going to cry, but yeah, they're having to suffer too in the midst of it all. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has destroyed and broken her bars. Her kings and her princes are among the nations. The law is no more, and her prophets find no vision from the Lord. Now, by saying the law is no more, there's nobody there to keep it, and there's nobody there to try to even follow it. There's none of her prophets that are actually having a vision from the Lord to warn the people. I've mentioned before that I think that Daniel as well as Ezekiel have been put in Babylonian captivity to help the children of Israel just try to stay faithful or to at least learn these lessons. And Ezekiel's preaching, Daniel's preaching would have reinforced, and think about this as well, would the captives that were carried away in 586 to Babylon, whenever they get down there to Babylon, maybe they have met these other captives that have been taken away in those two earlier deportations. Now you have Jeremiah's writings or Jeremiah's preaching, Ezekiel and Daniel, all three having an impact upon their lives. So that when it does come time for them to go back, that's going to encourage them to not sin. Hard lessons learned. And sometimes that's the only way we learn them, right? Yeah. I've learned not to get on a ladder on a tree now. Hard lessons learned. And that's the kind of thing that he's emphasizing. They had to learn it the hard way. So there's no more law. There's no more, the law had not been taken away. It didn't take place till Christ's death on the cross, obviously. But in essence, nobody's keeping the Old Testament law because they're under another king. The elders of the daughter of Zion sit on the ground and keep silent. They throw dust on their heads, gird themselves with sackcloths. The virgins of Jerusalem bow their heads to the ground. We already saw Jeremiah 17, the condemnation that he had for the elders, the shepherds at that time. What if they had done things differently? And that kind of goes back again to what I was saying earlier. Maybe if more of us got together and talked these things out, maybe we can encourage all the elders and those that are trying to make these hard decisions. Instead of watching our brethren sin and just, after a while, what do? You sit on the ground and just, what else can I do? I mean, I'm frustrated. I can do certain things, but I can't go no further than some things. We may lose some people over this. They're silent. What else can they say? And then it's just the idea of throwing dust on their heads, girding themselves with sackcloth. They're just weeping. They're bemoaning the fact that there's nothing else. I mean, what else can they do? And the virgins, everybody is just, as we talked about in chapter 1, first, there's the ideal of eking out a living. But then secondly, there's also that idea of this is where our sins have got us. And so now you find a discouraged, dejected people. And maybe the only thing that's keeping them alive is just trying to eke out a living day by day. Yeah. There's no joy here. There's no rejoicing here. There's no peace here. There's nothing. Sadness, heartache, sorrow, and perhaps echoes of prophets ringing in their ears, but now having to deal with what's left over. So Jeremiah, he takes a break here and he shares his heart. My eyes fail with tears. He's cried so much he can't cry anymore. My heart is troubled, my inward parts. My bile, the ideal is the liver, is poured on the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. The children and the infants faint in the street of the city. I can't even begin to imagine what that would be like. I just can't. And these children are saying, where's the grain and wine? Where's something to eat? Mama, I can hear it. Mama, I'm hungry. Well, I am too, honey, but I've done the best I can. I can't come up with nothing. Well, maybe a little grape juice, maybe something to help me out. There's nothing left, honey. I can't give you nothing. And they swoon like the wounded in the streets as their life is poured out in their mother's bosom. Mom sees that the child's about to die, and so she just hugs it to her chest until the child dies. And God says, how can I console you? To what shall I liken you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What shall I compare with you that I may comfort you? How can I comfort you? You're watching your children die. You may have lost your husband in the battles. There's nothing left, and now the children are dying out. And so your ruin is spread wide as the sea. Who can heal you? So again, in these verses 11 through 13, he gets very specific as to what's going on. But then what's caused it? He keeps coming back to this. What's caused it? Your prophets have seen false and deceptive visions. They have not uncovered your iniquity to bring back your captives. In other words, your sin's still there. They have envisioned for you false prophecies, and you believed them. You didn't want to hear the bad news. So you found the guys that gave you the good news, the guys that make you feel good about yourself, the guys that make you feel like, hey, everything's going to be just fine and everybody's going to be hunky-dory. And it wasn't that way. And now you're in the situation that you're in, and they've given you these false delusions. And what do you have? And Jeremiah is not saying, I told you so, but the emphasis still is there as he writes these words. Those who pass by clap their hands at you. A lot of times clapping our hands today suggests the ideal of approval. A lot of times back then, it was more the ideal of, I'm glad you got that. You know, it's more the ideal of I just went blank of what I was going to try to say. It's more the ideal of discouragement. They hiss and they shake their heads at the daughter of Jerusalem. As I'm looking at verse 15, I'm sometimes wondering if maybe it was some of those detachment of soldiers from the Babylonians mocking the Jews that are left there. They're eating okay. Everything's going okay with them. They're going to make sure that they've got what they need. And so it's my supposition. I can't prove this, but it's my supposition that those who are strong enough to walk by are hissing and shaking their head, and they looking around at the dump, and they're looking around at the walls, and they looking around at everything. And is this the city that is called the perfection of beauty, the joy of the whole earth? I hear them mocking these people. So it's not bad enough that they're suffering. It is. It's not bad enough that they're struggling with watching their loved ones die, even after the armies have gone. It's not bad enough that all this, but now you've got the mockers. Yeah, you're the ones that always talked about how beautiful Jerusalem was, and here you are amidst ruin and rubble, and there's not much left. All your enemies have opened their mouth against you. Probably, if it's like most alliances that we see in the world today, when Babylon came with their massive army, all the other armies that decided to help Jerusalem decided, oh, well, this may not turn out so good for us. Tell you what, Babylon, let's take your side. You know, I could just see that happening. I could see that happening. All your enemies have opened their mouth against you, hiss and gnash their teeth. We have swallowed her up. This is the day we've waited for. We found it. We have seen it. Yes, we are so glad that Jerusalem is destroyed. Jerusalem has been a thorn in our flesh. We remember going back to Jeremiah that he condemned Moab. He would condemn Ammon. He would condemn Egypt. He would condemn all these other nations because they had come to her aid or because they had taken advantage of the situation. So now, again, these foes that have been around since Israel had conquered the land of Canaan are now laughing. Yes, we've waited for this. We've waited for this. And they're probably taking the Lord out of the picture, obviously. And the Lord is reminding them, or Jeremiah reminds them, no, the Lord has done what he has purposed. He warned, he told you over and over again. He has fulfilled his word, which he commanded in days of old. Now think about it again. Go back and reread Deuteronomy, how God had warned time and again, if you don't keep the law, then all these other nations will be thorns in your flesh. How he had warned time and again. It's not like the children of Israel hadn't been warned. It's not like the children of Israel did not know the law. They obviously did, but they went through the motions. They were doing what they thought God wanted them to do, but then they thought, well, God is over there, like a lot of people do today. The Lord is in his holy temple. He's not outside the temple walls. Whatever we do outside the temple walls, we'll get away with. You know, that don't matter as long as we don't do it in the building, right? In the temple, in the tabernacle, anywhere around those areas there. You know, could that be where we get the same idea today? I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Things don't change. They really don't, do they?
No, they don't.
They don't. and so they're rejoicing. I believe, again, think about the idea, looking at verse 16, think about how the world today, most of the world today would rejoice if Christianity fell, if it fell apart. It seems like that Christianity is being attacked more and more and more today. There would be rejoicing over that. But like the Jews, and like what Jeremiah was trying to get the Jews to be, the faithful will be saved. The faithful will make it. And that's what he's trying to emphasize. So again, he comes back to verse 15 or 17. The Lord has done what he purposed. Don't be thinking again, Nebuchadnezzar, all these other nations. No, the Lord has done what he purposed. He has fulfilled his word, which he commanded in days of old. And again, these are just some of those passages that you read in Exodus and Deuteronomy especially. He has thrown down and not pitied. He has caused an enemy to rejoice over you. He has exalted the horn, the strength. There's that ideal again of strength. He's exalted the horn of your adversaries. Their heart cried out to the Lord. O wall of Jerusalem, or wall of the daughter of Zion, let tears run down like a river day and night. Give yourself no relief. Give your eyes no rest. They cry in the night at the beginning of the watches. Pour out your heart like water before the face of the Lord. Lift your hands toward him for the life of your young children who faint from hunger at the head of every street. I think what he's doing here, the Lord has promised it, but notice there at the same time, most of the people of that day would always attach military strength and power to the local gods of the area. So they would call, when Jerusalem was destroyed, they would say concerning God, what? Cry out to the Lord, pour your hands to him for the life of your young children. As he's not been able to save you from the Babylonians, he's not going to save the people that are left here. There's more mockery. You're crying out to the Lord, but is this the same God who allowed all this to happen? Are not the Babylonian gods stronger than Yahweh? And that's what the world will think. And I often think about that too, as I read through the scriptures and meditate on that. I think about the ideal as well as how does God feel about how people feel about him? We know that if we spurn him, he will spurn us. He will give us exactly what we decide to do. But God still exists. He's still going to be God. He's still going to do what's right. That's also amazing. He's not punishing. I'm trying to be careful how I say this. He's not punishing out of anger as much as he's punishing out of the relationship of a father and children. Now, immediately you might think, well, that goes against some passages where it says the anger of the Lord. And again, I think it's the same idea of a parent being angry at a child. You still love that child deeply, but you're angry at what that child is doing to themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that proviso has to be put out there. And so you have God using these other nations as disciplinary action against his own people, but he still has a greater plan for his own people. And that was for his people to be protected in Babylon and to come back and to have learned some lessons, hard lessons. But by the time we open up the New Testament, we find again the children of Israel still struggling with a lot of that stuff, right? And they seem to get the Sabbath day good.
Well, but they went too far on the Sabbath day.
That's exactly right.
They go to the extreme again.
And that's us, is it not? I mean, literally, is that not us as human beings, period? And that's, again, as I've shared with you before, my brother told me years ago, stay in the middle of the road. And that is so hard. That is so hard sometimes because you want to overreact. And again, either way, you're going to wind up in the ditch. And the thing that I see this in the church a lot, and you do too, some problem will come up and people will automatically overreact. Oh no, what are we going to do? You know, and it's like the end of the world as we know it. Well, no, it's not. It's not. We're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to change some things maybe that we're so used to doing. We're going to have to get out of our comfort zone a little bit and learn how to use Zoom. And you know what I'm talking about. We're going to have to do some things that we don't want to do, but we've got to do at this moment in time. And again, when folks get out of their comfort zone, they lose hope. They lose faith. They lose the only thing that they really need. So yeah, brother, you're exactly right. God has used these other people to do that. He says, and I see Jeremiah praying, he says, cry out to the Lord. Cry out to him. The tears running down like a river. Give yourself no relief, no rest. It's mourning, you're mourning and you're weeping like that. But listen, you pour out your heart and lift your hands to him for the life of your young children. Even in this situation, we might be more wanting to pray for ourselves. Lord, I've been hungry. I hadn't eaten the last couple of days, but we have the little child there. And you know as well as I do that we will move heaven and earth to feed the child before we'll feed ourselves. Yeah. And they're crying, and Jeremiah is saying, in essence, cry out to the Lord. Cry out to the Lord. And he says, and this again is just they're fainting from hunger. And then verse 20 kicks in. Lord, consider, to whom have you done this? Now again, Jeremiah's not pulling no punches. Lord, you've done this. Should the women eat their offspring, the children they have cuddled? Should the priest and prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord? And again, we're reminded of the fact in the book of Leviticus, chapter 26 and verse 29, God had prophesied of the time when they were going to eat their own children. And we find the same thing again in the book of 2 Kings, where there were two women, where there were women that had actually killed their children to eat them during the famine. I just went totally blank. I thought it was during the time of Solomon, but I know that's not the case. There was the time of a king that he walked among the walls and everybody was so hungry. And one of the women came and says, we made an agreement that we eat our children. We ate my child last night. Now it's our turn to eat this child. I can't even begin to imagine that kind of hunger and pain in that respect. And yet that's exactly what they were doing. These very children they have cuddled. And we would sit back and say, there's no way in the world we would do anything like that. But we've never been in their dire straits. We've never, and I think as I'm thinking about it, we've never been in their dire straits, but also we've got to realize that perhaps by this time they have become so hardened to death. They have become so hardened by hunger and so hardened to everything else they've seen that slaughtering a child is nothing to them now. That's how desperate they are. And that's, again, I can't even envision that in my own mind. I can't envision that. Verse 21, young and old lie on the grounds in the streets. My virgins and my young men have fallen by the sword. You, God, have slain them in their day of your anger. You have slaughtered and not pitied. You had invited as a feast day the terrors that surround me. In the day of the Lord's anger, there was no refugee or survivor. Those whom I have borne and brought up, my enemies have destroyed. I think it's because of this passage that I believe that the reason why there was 3 carryings away is that God saved, even though they had to go into Babylonian captivity and had to sort of work as slaves, he perhaps saved the best of the people at that time. The ones that were at least trying to do what God wanted them to do. The ones that would learn from these 70 years and from perhaps seeing what Nebuchadnezzar and what God had done in punishing these people. So all of this comes into play. And he says, you have invited them as a feast day, those whom I've born and brought up, God's own people. So now we get to chapter 3. Now Jeremiah has described in chapters 1 and 2 what he's seen. Now he's going to talk about the hope that he has. And as I said, this chapter has 3 sets of the Hebrew alphabet, 66 verses to get across his point. And then he'll pick back up in chapter 4 and 5 with the 22 verses. So he says, I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. I've seen what sin finally does. He has led me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. He has turned his hand against me time and time again throughout the day. I think Jeremiah, sickened by everything he's seen, heartbroken because of what has happened, struggling with the message he had to preach that, excuse me, struggling with the message that he had to preach time and time again, seeing it ignored, getting frustrated, weeping over the sins of the kings, all the way down to the priests, all the way down to the common Jew. He's seen it. He has seen it. God has made me walk in darkness and not in light, and turned his hand against me. Jeremiah said, I didn't want this. This is not the life I wanted. This is not the life I wanted to see. And there's something to be said about that. Here's this guy that continues to do what God wants him to do. No matter what the cost, he's going to continue to do it. And the beauty of the whole thing is that after a while, he just gets sick of seeing it all. He's aged my flesh and my skin, broken my bones. Was his bones actually broken? We don't read anywhere where they actually were, but you think about him being stuck in the mire, in the mud. Think about him being beaten. Were there possibilities of fracture? Yeah, possible, very possibly. Because all he was doing was being God's spokesman. That's all he was. So I see a young man, that after preaching and teaching all these years, he's just become old quicker than anything we can imagine. His back stooped, gray hairs, gray beard, striving to continue to try to bring out this message. And again, how does he look at it? He says he's surrounded. God has besieged me. It's like taking a city. He surrounded me. What did he surround me with? Not with stones to protection, but bitterness and woe. And it just seems like nothing's going to get any better here. Hardship. Think about his weariness. You know, this guy had to have gotten tired time after time preaching and being ignored and despised and rejected, and everything he said was not what they wanted to hear. So kill the messenger. That's just the simplest solution, right? And so he's bitterness and woe. He's walking around. He sees the children wanting food. There's nothing there. Again, it's just, he has set me in dark places, like the dead of long ago. All I see is dark. I don't see any hope. I don't see any hope. And he struggles with this. He's hedged me in so that I cannot get out. He's made my chain heavy. Even when I cry and shout, he shuts out my prayer. He blocks my ways with hewn stones. He's made my paths crooked. Even in this, now, one of the things that gets me about this is how, as he talks about God and his relationship with God, here's a man that, a lot like Job, that has seen suffering. It's affected him personally. And when you're suffering that way, sometimes you wind up blaming God. So notice, I can't get out of this. My chain is heavy. When I cry and shout to him, he shuts out my prayer. God's not listening to me. Here's a man that's just ready to give up. He's blocked my ways. He's made my paths crooked. No matter what, it's not getting any better. He's been like a bear to me, lying in wait. You know, he's just waiting for me to walk by, just to attack, like a lion in ambush. Well, that's not very nice to describe God that way, but that's how he feels. One of the things that I've appreciated about the book of Job and here is the idea that God can take it. God can take anything we say about him. He knows who he is. He is self-sufficient. He doesn't need us, obviously. The fact that he made me, created me, and so forth makes me wonder why sometimes. But again, we all ask those questions maybe from time to time. The thing is that God can handle it. Now, as in Job's case, and as in Jeremiah's case, God's going to speak, and I don't want to use the word defend, because God needs no defense. God is God. You know, he doesn't have to defend himself to us. Our struggles are the fact that we can't understand what he's doing and why he's doing it that way. All we see is the problems and the trials and the difficulties, and we're too busy a lot of times focusing on the problems and the trials and the difficulties, then we're not looking and seeing how God is working and using these things. Now think about this with regards to COVID. Think about this with regards to all that's been going on, unrest in this country right now. What is God doing right now in the midst of this? It seems like it becomes easy for me when I'm watching the news or something like that, to blame a certain group of people or to blame this or blame that or something like that. That's not bringing about a solution. What is God trying to teach me right now? And I think that's a lesson that needs to be brought out in the church today. What is God trying to teach us through this COVID? That our faith was too much in ourselves? That we've gone through the motions for too long? Is he trying to wake us up to what we need to be doing that we haven't been? these are just some things that I've thought. These are just some things that I've considered. And I'm sure that there's others that have considered a lot more in a lot more detail than I have. But the thing is God can handle it. God, I don't understand why you let my loved one die. It's not for you to understand, okay? It is what it is, and you've got to deal with it. And so what do I say? God's still in charge. God's going to do what he's going to do. And I'm going to trust him to bring everything out all right. And that's it. And so as he's struggling with this, he says, I cry out and God's not listening to my prayers anymore. Was he praying for the people? Probably. Could God have saved the people? Yes, if they have chosen to repent. Was Jeremiah pleading on the people's behalf? Yes, I believe so. But again, praying for people that won't change, if they don't change, it's not going to help anything, right? And that's a sobering thought. And then we get to thinking to ourselves, well, my prayers aren't making it that high. God is hearing our prayers. Now, as Jeremiah's looking at it, he says, you have shut out my prayer. You're not listening to me. And God heard every word Jeremiah had to say. God knew exactly what was going on. It was Jeremiah that was struggling. And the people had given him a hard time. The kings and the princes have given him a hard time. The Babylonians are the only ones out of the whole group that were showing him some mercy and compassion out of it all. And the thing is, you would not have expected that from the enemy of his people, but that's who did it. So he says, you've shut out my prayers. You blocked my ways. I can't go anywhere because, Lord, everywhere I go, it just seems like my way is blocked everywhere I turn. I have to walk around things. You've been like a bear. You've been like a lion. You've torn me in pieces. Seeing the kids, seeing the suffering, seeing the heartache. And he made me desolate. He's been his bow and set me as a target for the arrow. And this was from God. So he's, like Job, struggling with a lot here. And I appreciate what he has to say. So he's caused the arrows of his quiver to pierce my kidneys, to pierce my loins. I have become the ridicule of all my people. So here he was, literally stuck in the middle. As elders, we can understand that, right? Yeah. You've got a group that wants this, you've got a group that wants this, you've got a group that wants this. Then you have not only that, but you have your wife and all these others at home giving you these ideas and your thoughts. And sometimes you're afraid to raise your head unless the arrow comes and hits you in the heart again, You know what I'm saying, brother? You've been there. Yeah. Preachers have been there, because you're just like, what else? And that's what he's saying here. He's saying there, he says, you've torn, I'm the target. We went through something at South Cobb not too long ago that no matter what was done, we lost some folks. Okay. We've lost some folks. And at one point, I was the guy, because it involved one of our elders, it involved the other elder. And I was the guy, and of course, I was the guy that this group wanted this to happen, this group wanted this to happen. And so how am I going to solve this problem? And I'm catching it from both sides. I'm like, oh, no, I didn't want this. I didn't know this was going to happen. That's part of leadership, right? It's part of being a preacher, part of being an elder, part of being anybody that you're trying to be to serve the Lord. That's exactly what's going on with Jeremiah. And I guess in a sense, there's comfort in the fact that we're not the only ones. There's comfort in the fact that there will always be the arrows that are going to come our way. Sometimes they may seem like they're coming from the Lord. Sometimes they're coming from people. Sometimes they're coming from folks that we dismiss because they don't have a ball in the game. You know what I'm trying to say? They don't have anything to say about it, but everybody's got to give their opinion, right?
Yeah.
He goes on and he says, he has caused the arrows of his quiver to pierce my loins. That's the second time he's made that point. All right. Torn me in pieces. He's pierced my loins. I've become the ridicule of all my people. Their taunting song all the day. I can just picture them. Let's go hear Jeremiah and see what doom and gloom he's got to say today. You know, I could hear that. I could hear them saying that. He said, their taunting song all the day has filled me with bitterness. And yet he kept on preaching. And he kept on trying to do what he was called to do. He struggled with that. We've gone through the book and we've seen how there were times when he wished he didn't. We can understand that. He made me drink wormwood, and he's broken my teeth with gravel, covered me with ashes. You moved my soul far from peace. I have forgotten prosperity. I have forgotten what's good. And I said, my strength and my hope have perished from the Lord. One thing I love about Job, one thing I love about Jeremiah, is they both were honest enough to pray these honest prayers and say these things honestly. They knew that God could handle it. They also knew that God was still in charge. They didn't understand all the whys and the wherefores, just like we don't understand all the whys and the wherefores. And the beauty of it is he says, you know, I know before it's all over with, he said, I know that everything's going to work out. I know it's going to work out. He's just as far down as he can go. And so in essence, he said, I've said my strength and my hope have perished from the Lord. But look at verse 19. Remember my affliction and roaming. So he's poured out his heart. It seems like God's not listening, but he doesn't give up. He doesn't quit praying. Remember my affliction and roaming, the wormwood and the gall, the bitterness. My soul still remembers and sinks within me. This I recall to my mind. Therefore, I have hope. As he's looking at all that he sees, he says, through the Lord's mercies, we're not consumed. We're still a nation. We're still God's people because of God's mercy. The church is still God's people because of God's mercy. Through the Lord's mercies, we are not consumed because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. I hope in him. When you've lost hope in everything else, people, governments, you name it, when you've lost hope in everything else, you've still got the Lord. The Lord is my portion. It's because of the Lord's mercies that we still have the Jewish nation. Sure, they're in Babylonian captivity. Sure, some of them are still around me starving to death. But we've not been totally destroyed. We're not like the Babylonians. We're not like the Assyrians. We're not like a lot of these other nations that have come and gone. We're still there. The church is still there. We're still God's people, and we will always be God's people. And I just appreciate this passage. Like I said, whenever you see how far he's gone down, and then he just says, you know what? His compassions fail not. They're new every morning, just like the sun coming up. I may not know a lot of things, but I know the sun's going to come up in the morning unless the Lord comes again. God's compassions do not fail. Great is your faithfulness. We're not, God, we're not faithful. God, we question. God, we wonder. God, we struggle. God, we have problems. God, we have difficulties. You're faithful. You're going to be faithful to your word. You have been faithful to your word. Punishing your people was probably the hardest thing you've ever done, but you're faithful to your word. And that should be encouraging to all of us. God is always going to be faithful to his word. So who does he trust? It's not himself. It's not the Babylonian envoys that's now taking over. It's not the priest and the so forth that are left, if there were any. It's not in the things of this world. The Lord is my portion, and I hope in him. When you have, and could it be that sometimes that God has to bring us all the way down to where we can't see any glimmer of hope whatsoever, that we at that point in time see him as our only hope? Could that be part of the reason why in the 1930s and so forth, during the Great Depression, more people were willing to listen to the gospel and change their lives at that point in time? Then right after that, I mean, what happened right after we got out? In fact, from what I've been told, you know more about this than I would, obviously because of the idea, but right after the Great Depression, we probably would have stayed in the Great Depression had it been for the war. Yeah. And the war is what, and think about that, the war, World War II, that war was what saved us in a sense as a country because, what were we doing? Money? There wasn't any. Now everybody's to work, making what? Armaments and everything like that. The sad tragedy of it is you go from one bad thing to another bad thing. Young men being killed all the time in a war. And so you think about the cost. And then right after the war, then we went through some good times. We've gone through some good times. And now here we are back in times that are struggles again. Could it be again that we have gotten away from the Lord, that we're, not that I'm saying that we ever were a Christian nation, you know what I'm trying to say there, but could it be that when at least we realized that we needed God's help, that God was more merciful to us? Now we're to the point to where we've made ourselves gods and we don't need him anymore. So I'm thinking out loud, is COVID and all the things that we've gone through in the last couple of years waking us up to the reality that we're not as brilliant and so forth as we think we are, and that we need God? Could this be the most right time in the world to teach the gospel? I think so. I think so. My opinion. So he says, the Lord is good to those who wait for him. Waiting. How many of us love that? We could preach a good long sermon on that list right there, right? None of us like to wait. We can't wait in a line. We've now gotten to the point to where most of, in our home, where my wife does the Kroger. All I got to do is go drive the car up there and deliver it to my car. That's what's happened because of COVID. And that's kind of nice. And the fact that we don't buy a lot of extra stuff that we don't need, that we wanted or something. But on the flip side of the deal is waiting. We don't like to wait. We don't like to wait for nothing. And it's good for those who wait for him. So I think this passage teaches us so much in that when things are the worst, when you're seeing the things that you just cannot even begin to imagine, when you're seeing pain and heartache and so forth, if we keep our faith and trust in the Lord, then we're going to make it. Even if we die, we're going to make it, right?
Yeah.
It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. So here's twice in this 25 and 26, we're to wait on God. Number two, we have to hope in God, and we have to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. So I'm not going to be able to save myself out of this situation, Jeremiah says. I can't make food that's not there. I can't go out in the fields and pick it because all that's been destroyed. I don't know exactly how this is going to work out. So all I can do is to keep my faith in God and wait. Be patient, and not just wait, but wait quietly. Now, earlier, he has kind of griped about it a little bit, right? But now, I think, again, he's thinking through all this. Is God teaching him a lesson? Again, does this book, as well as Job, kind of fit together? Two different guys, not quite the same circumstances, but the same lessons. The same lessons. And he says, wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. And it is good for a man to bear the yoke in his youth. So has he come, and we don't know how old he is by this time. Well, obviously getting very close to the end of his life, because again, we remember that he was taken to Egypt and killed there. So the question is, I think what he's trying to get across, verse 27, it's better for a young man to learn this while he's young, rather than having to learn these hard lessons as he grows older. It seems like, and you agree with me here, I believe as well, that a lot of times a young person's heart's a lot more tender than an older person, because we've seen too much. We've heard too much. We've been through too much. And after a while, we just get kind of calloused about some things. Yeah. A young person hasn't. So this is the reason why, again, it's good we bear the yoke in his youth. So he says, let him sit alone and keep silent. God has laid it on him. Who? The youth? Yeah. Perhaps the young person needs to sit alone and keep silent. I could take that way out of context and preach a sermon to young people. Folks, young people, you need to get off your phones every once in a while. Get off your iPads, get off the computers, sit quietly, meditate, think to yourself, sit quietly, right? Yeah. Sit alone, keep silence, because God has laid it on us. Get back into the Word. See what God is saying in His Word. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes him. Be full of reproach. In other words, learn these hard disciplines while you're young. While you're young. Bearing the yoke, sitting alone, keeping silent. There yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes him, and be full of reproach. Struggle with those difficulties now, so that later you'll have something even greater to fall back on. Now, I hope I'm not reading anything more into that text than maybe it should be, but we should be helping our young people to get ready for these moments. There might still be hope. And so here's another one of those passages that really emphasize some ideas that we need to grasp. The Lord will not cast off forever. though he causes grief, he will show compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. For he does not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men. So there's so much hope in those verses. Children of Israel being taken into captivity, the Lord will not cast off forever. Could it be again that as Jeremiah dictated these things to Baruch, that maybe again he's dictating this to somebody else, and before it's all over with, Jeremiah's words may have been taken down to Babylon, read among the children of Israel that were there? Then you have Ezekiel there, as well as Daniel, all these words. What do they need to be reminded of? The Lord will not cast off forever. He had prophesied that it's only going to be 70 years. 70 years is a lifetime. For most folks, it is, right? Yeah. And there were some that weren't going to make it back, but the bottom line is, Jeremiah says, the Lord's going to bring us back. Even though he causes grief, he's going to show compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. He does not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men. This is not something God wants to do. He doesn't want to punish. If we again look at God as the Father, then we see that he doesn't want to punish. If we see God as a God that's just out there to get us, well, if that's the truth, we would none of us be here. Yeah. So it's how we look at God. It's how we look at God. So, trying to think of good paths to stop. There's just so much here that could breathe. Let's just stop there, okay? We'll pick up with verse 33. That's a good place to stop, yeah, because we've got 33 more verses at the end of this chapter. Okay. We'll pick up right there with verse 34 next week, kind of remind ourselves a little bit about what we've been talking about, and then see what he's got to say in the rest of the book. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this down. That'll be in November, won't it? Yes, it will be in November. Yep. It's going to be November the 3rd. So I'm going to put 11/3/2021. All right. We'll pick up there next week. It's going to be the day after my birthday. All right. That's cool. I get to take my birthday off anyway. So there we go. There we go. Thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
All right, Tommy.
And hang in there.
Okay.
Giving us something to think about, and give us some serious thought about us getting together as elders.
We've talked about it before that we may do so we'll bring it up again.
All right, we'll bring it up and let me know. I'd love to sit down and do that. I really would.
Okay.
Thanks again, brother.
All right, Tommy.
Hang in there.
Bye.
Bye-bye.